So my talk is called, where is it? There it is. Hedwig Conrad-Martius's Universal Ontology. So I open with this little quote by Eberhard Ave Lallemant, who is Conrad-Martius's student and friend, and is also one of our historians, like Herbert Spiegelberg, of the early phenomenological movement. He writes, "The phenomenon of real being opened for Conrad-Martius the way to a universal, phenomenologically founded ontology, and in turn a philosophical cosmology." So that's what I'll be talking about today, is her later work, which is characterized by her philosophical cosmology, but rather than proceeding to a philosophical cosmology inductively, that is from the special sciences of physics, theoretical physics, cosmology, to this ultimate systematic philosophy of hers, the universal ontology proceeds the other way, that is, a priori from first principles. And that's what we're hoping to learn about. The ontological phenomenology of Hedwig Conrad-Martius is understood to represent an important form of early phenomenological realism. This representation is certainly valid, but I would like to emphasize the universalism that encompasses her realism. Conrad-Martius sought to give an ontological account of everything, absolutely everything that there is. She writes in her book Das Sein, quote, "Not only material, formal, and categorical objects, not only real and ideal, not only concrete and abstract objects, not only pure entities, qualia, not only purely fictitious objects, but there are also purely conceptual objects, that is, objects to which nothing actually objective corresponds." End quote. Absolutely everything includes much more than the real. Conrad-Martius shows us how such radically distinct things as actualities and virtualities exist in relation to each other, summoning metaphysical categories and powers. Her real ontological method discloses the reality of such universals as infinity, nothingness, and the being itself of things themselves. Taking such things seriously entails the kind of ontological consequences that Conrad-Martius upholds. The foundational hypothesis of being itself brings in its wake a real fundamental original movement into being from beyond being, and this movement comes to characterize the constitutive actualization of ontic phenomena. This, in its turn, entails a binary of the primordial contraction, or what she calls sunkenness, of substantial being, and a corresponding ecstatic radiation, and its reduplication, or polarization into equiprimordial ontic phenomena at a fourfold root of natural reality. The account of transphysical entities taking root at the origin of physical and psychical reality suggests not only a radical fundamental ontology, but a general universalism that is the goal of her real ontology. This is her universal ontology. Hedwig Conrad-Martius's universal ontology is both comprehensive, if not in fact exhaustive, and in its analogical development intuitively comprehensible. I hope to outline and illustrate a number of extant disclosed components of this universal ontology, and also to follow the outline of Conrad-Martius's unfinished project. There are three things that can be taken to indicate Conrad-Martius's universalism. 1, her philosophical spirituality. 2, her late cosmological turn. And 3, her unfinished project of universal ontology. Since Conrad-Martius received from Husserl her initial directions in ontology, it will be important to start by showing her relations, or the relations of her philosophy to his, including the relation of real ontology, the ontology of reality, to universal ontology, as outlined by Husserl. I will also take this opportunity to share some of Husserl's theological lessons and spiritual outlines that appear to be confirmed in the philosophical activity of Conrad-Martius, despite their historical and doctrinal schism. Following these indications, I hope to outline Conrad-Martius's own unique vision, method, and doctrine of universal ontology. Okay. Section 1, on the import and scope of universal ontology. Thanks to a great deal of recent books and conferences and other interests in her work, Hedwig Conrad-Martius's philosophy is having a renaissance. The translation of her work into English is still in its infancy, with Krine Gerschwantner bringing the first full book translation into English soon. But even in the secondary literature, we are beginning to receive the spirit of this powerful phenomenologist. It seems that with Hedwig Conrad-Martius, we receive not only a very powerful spirit in the metaphorical sense, but an intellectual power that for nearly a century the intellectual world was not ready for. In Plotinus's Ennead 666, the question of the real ontological status of the idea of materiality itself is summoned in his concept of the ousion kathoulon ton eidon, the universal substance of the ideas. He writes at exactly 6666. And in the reduplicative positing of the energeia ontos energeia, the actual actuality, at 66636. This pure materiality or substantial nature of the idea in general stands at the root of a tradition of the ontology of power, as Ian Hamilton Grant refers to it, that resurfaces in the romantic Naturphilosophie of Schelling and is now finding a home in certain corners of today's currents of new realism. If matter is a power opposed to the energy of spirit and to the spirit of the Platonic ideas, then what sort of an idea is the prime matter of Aristotle's God, or Husserl's Urhule, and the universe constituted by its nature? It is the essence that exceeds reduction, the essence of excess and expansion. This excess is a special kind of idea. It is an idea with the power to sublate traditions of idealism. She writes, quote, "Everything has its essence, its eidos. By its nature, it is limited to what it is. A beast, a brute, a storm, a weed has lost to a certain degree the delimitation belonging to the eidos in question without thereby losing the whole eidos. The eidos is still there. The eidos is only something that has gotten out of hand. In a way, it overflows eidetically." And I just added that bit a moment ago, so excuse the edits. That was autocorrect. The, quote, existential mysticism, a term she uses, of Hedwig Conrad-Martius might be considered one of these ontologies of power. Power ontology overrides idealism along the same lines of traditional activity, but modulates it in the key of fullness. The intellectual world will soon see Conrad-Martius's critique of Husserlian idealism and of the idealism of the Daseinslehre of Heidegger as part of an intellectual awakening to a new dimension of the depth, profundity, and power of substance and existence. Conrad-Martius unearths the innermost dynamics of metaphysical being, draws this intellectual understanding through the ligature of nature all the way to a new vision of the cosmos. Today, we hope to touch this power in the form of her mature project of universal ontology. Hedwig Conrad-Martius had a philosophically magic touch. She applied to many fields the power of the origin of all fields. She receives from Husserl the form of a logical technology that gives her an Archimedean intellectual strength, but she modifies this form and inverts it. She receives from Reinach the resolve to discover absolute objectivity. Conrad-Martius adds to eidetic analysis something called horizon analysis, and transforms this logical technology into a tool for pure ontic research of the metaphysical, substantial, existential, and ultimately real and maximally transcendental system of reality and its extended framework of universal ideality. In Conrad-Martius's philosophy, the world is securely situated in an all-encompassing framework that spans from the innermost center to the outermost sphere. This framework is an instance of philosophical cosmology as well as of universal ontology. Under the aspect of philosophical cosmology, this framework is contextualized in terms of her philosophy of space and time, But there is something even more general about this framework. This something more general is present from her earliest works, present at every peak expression and constitutive of every new landing of her progress. This ubiquitous framework can be seen in her overall method, in the multiplicity of resulting doctrines when the method is applied in numerous fields, and in the unity of a doctrine of universal ontology. And this unity is what we hope to see. Section 1.2, Universal Ontology, Husserl and Conrad-Martius. In her 1957 book, Das Sein, Conrad-Martius identifies a litany of kinds of things filling out the scope of her universal ontology: material, formal, and categorical objects, real and ideal, concrete and abstract objects, pure entities, qualia, purely fictitious objects, and also purely conceptual objects. We'll recall from the quote before. In Husserl's 1906-1907 lectures, translated by Claire Ortiz Hill as Introduction to Logic and Theory of Knowledge, Husserl gives a similar litany, defining his own, quote, universal concept of ontology, which deals with, quote, being in general in the most universal universality. And he writes, being, in the broadest sense, in that of theory of science as formal ontology, is each and every thing that can figure as the subject of a statement, each and every thing about which we in truth speak, each and every thing that can in truth be referred to as being. And that does not merely concern things, processes, and what is otherwise real, but even numbers, contradictions, propositions, concepts, theories, ethical or aesthetic ideas. In short, the multiform variety of ideal objects, and of those that cannot meaningfully be said to have a place in spatiotemporal reality. In this work, and in many other places, Husserl goes on to distinguish from one another not only formal ontology and material ontology, but also metaphysical ontology, a priori ontology, real ontology, and universal ontology. Some of these distinctions are well known, for instance, from the tradition of formal ontology that takes off from the logical investigations. But in some of these works, Husserl only intends to identify parts of the whole program of ontology in order to pursue, for instance, a general noetic eidetics, analytics, leaving the noematic hyletics in the dark. The full circle of noetic and noematic or hyletic disciplines and their general theory appears only infrequently, only in the context of an a priori ontology and universal ontology. There are many other places where Husserl discusses universal ontology, its connection to real ontology and its connection to metaphysics. Although Husserl's scholarship of the past decades has not emphasized universal ontology, there is a more recent trend to emphasize the later metaphysical development of Husserl's transcendental philosophy, especially in anticipation of themes from Husserliana volumes 42 and 43. Divisions and developments of phenomenological philosophy occlude phenomenology's underlying universality. One could find paths to such universality in many directions, such as Husserl's framing of phenomenology as first philosophy, Heidegger's radical transformation of it, Finck's advanced phenomenological developments, Temeniecka's continuation of these fronts, or the eidetic metaphysical research and development of the earlier realist phenomenologists. Husserl has his own phenomenologically reformed metaphysics, and even a phenomenological theology. Already in Ideas 1, section 58, God stands as an altogether different form of transcendence than both the transcendental ego and the transcendence of the world. In Ideas 2, Husserl effects a revision of the monadological transcendental ego as a noematically, hyletically contextualized I-pole of affects and actions. Let us briefly consider a couple other selections from Husserl's work that highlight phenomenology's universal compass. In Logic and General Theory of Science, also translated by Claire Hill, in section 63, the ontology of spiritual being as an a priori science of spirit and consciousness, an ontology of spiritual being is described. This is an ontology of the spiritual layer of, Husserl writes, spirit, ensouled being, the flow of consciousness, and so on, which is a realm of nuclear meaning forms, forming a, quote, a priori framework. It is interesting to note that Conrad-Martius attended these lectures. Earlier in the text, the realm of meaning is described as having an inner structure displaying the amazingly regular pattern of an implemented mathematical theory of forms, resting on, quote, 4 basic kinds of form nuclei, forming fixed configurations into concrete meanings, such that all meaning is bound to fixed crystal configurations, and only so crystallized can have concrete being, end quote. This is the crystallization of the sediment layer that forms beneath the hyletic flux of consciousness. The formal ontological moment of eidetic analyses, in their noetic purity, form these crystals in a fixed, coherent crystal system, writes Husserl. We should bear in mind this formal ontological framework, resting, quote, on 4 basic kinds of form nuclei, when we look at the universal ontological crystal system of Conrad-Martius's framework. So we'll come back to that sort of way of framing it at the end when we look at her full-blown doctrine. Husserl opens the 3rd chapter of his first philosophy by declaring the need for a phenomenological metaphysics, a metaphysics in a new sense, he writes, a sense different from the sedimented received tradition that he is often engaged in criticizing. Phenomenologically reformed and reconstructed metaphysics receives some interesting development in Husserliana 42, the Grenzprobleme der Phenomenologie, in relation to Husserl's own sense of the prote-hule and related elements, ideal and real, primordial facticity and sensuality. This is clearly a fecund area for further research and development. I'm open to hearing more about any passages in Husserl that are especially programmatic in identifying Husserl's sense of universal ontology and how it connects to his sense of universal science and theory of science as Mathesis Universalis. But now let's see what Conrad-Martius might contribute to phenomenological metaphysics. Conrad-Martius came to Göttingen in late 1910, attended 2 of Husserl's winter semester lectures series that have been made available in English as The Basic Problems of Phenomenology by James G. Hart, and Logic and General Theory of Science by Claire Ortiz Hill. James Hart discusses the context of Conrad-Martius's real ontology in the preface to The Basic Problems, indicating passages where Husserl develops his sense of the ontology of reality, which is where Conrad-Martius picks up the method of, as Hart describes it, a noematic eidetics, or ontology of the real and really real. In addition to these 2 lecture series, Conrad-Martius also took courses dedicated to Hume, Kant, ethics, and courses under Reinach, from whom she picked up the emphasis on realism. In the context of the Great Phenomenological Schism, Conrad-Martius's enthusiasm for phenomenology, in her sense, shines as a beacon for the realist side of the debate, and this plays out historically in the unfortunate circumstances of the split between Husserl and his Göttingen circle of students. Although in this presentation we hope to see something of the unity of real ontology and universal ontology in Husserl and Conrad-Martius, we should also identify the aura of spirituality and religion that colored the split. This hue burned brightly in Conrad-Martius, just as it did in her own unique phenomenological method. 2. Method. In 2019, Hans Rainer Zepp published a collection of essays called Natur und Kosmos, Entwürfe der frühen Phänomenologie. In that volume, Rodney Parker provided Conrad-Martius's very early text, Über Ontologie. This text is a reaction to the kind of idealism expressed in Husserl's Ideas 1, especially section 49, absolute consciousness as the residuum after the annihilation of the world. But it also gives us an early formulation of Conrad-Martius's signature realistic method, which she calls the real ontological reduction. In this text, she distinguishes three phenomenological attitudes and reductions. 1. The epistemologically oriented phenomenological bracketing of the world thesis. This is the attitude by which the phenomenologist actively suspends the natural attitude about the world's positive reality, thetic positing, by a noetic act, so that its pure appearance can hover or float as an epistemologically purified, transcendental version of the world. This is known as the transcendental reduction, the phenomenological reduction in a narrow sense. 2. The eidetic reduction is the phenomenological epoche, the phenomenological reduction in a general sense. Through ideation, the essence is itself freed from the flux of experience, and a certain apodicticity is secured, but there is always a remaining excess that transcends this scientific activity. This excess is the result of an intentional myopia, the apparent blind spot of transcendental phenomenology. Here, the epistemological question of the correlation between factual data and noematic being is neutrally set aside. 3. The problem presented by the epistemologically purified transcendental version of the world in the immanence of absolute consciousness is the problem of how it got there originally, how it connects to reality, including its own reality, and this motivates the third attitude in reduction, the real ontological. Conrad-Martius's unique contribution to phenomenological method is the polar opposite of the first, transcendental, attitude and reduction. In this third reduction, the general thesis of the reality of the world is neither set aside neutrally nor negated, but fully positively activated. In the real ontological attitude and reduction, quote, "The world is assumed to be factually real, whether it exists or not," she writes. In this pre-existing framework, which James G. Hart calls a heuristic context, everything is seen as it were growing out or elevating itself from the real framework in which it participates. Here, the real being of the world is hypothetically posited, and things shine forth in their real being and in their self-rootedness, whether they are real in the primary physical sense, dreamed, imagined, or hallucinated. Pure ontic research, that is, the ontologically essential exploration of the real world, necessitates this reduction. The first of these reductions, we might suggest, sees the shimmering ideality of the noetic on the surface of the sea of meaning. The second reduction draws it out, mines the noiric sea, and explores its many regions. The third discovers the depth of the noema. 2. Vision. Another global aspect of Conrad-Martius's philosophy is what could be described as her philosophical spirituality. In a number of her works, such as her 1916 on the ontology and doctrine of appearance of the real external world, and in her 1956 seminar, Empirical and Transcendental Modes of Givenness of the Real World, spirituality and vision are thoroughly intermingled. Spiritual vision and spiritual comprehension are themes present throughout her works. In his 2020 book, James Hart brings these themes up right away in order to characterize her spiritual attitude. And I just want to note that there's a little footnote I added. Daniel DeSantis, who's here, translates the word erkenntnis theoretischen in her 1916 work as gnoseology, which is really cool. So in this footnote, I discuss the different words: epistemology, doctrine of appearance, and now with this third option, gnoseology, a little bit. So anyway, it's a footnote. You can see it and read it, but I'll leave it in the footnote section. So here, writes Hart, quote, "She shows how in a spiritual attitude one sees more than he properly sees, along with what is properly seen in the world, or the world or the milieu is present. In fact, It requires a peculiar and difficult act of experience to have only present what falls under the senses. Furthermore, the analysis of the spiritual attitude discloses that spiritual being has an essential relationship to the world, that man is being in the world, end quote. The spiritual attitude is an inversion of the transcendental phenomenological attitude, but it could also be thought of as a different version of it. If it is the polar opposite of the transcendental phenomenological attitude, number one above, it should be understood that it is not a reversion to an empirical or natural attitude. It is the opposite of the reduction to the noetic singularity of the transcendental ego. It is an orientation towards the noematic excessiveness of meaning that includes the real world, and so much more. The real ontological spiritual attitude is a deep dive into objectivity, and the reduction corresponds, the reduction corresponding to it, the real ontological reduction, institutes a powerful phenomenological method. If we need to tie this to a memorable image, we might look, as Hart does, to the experiments in projection of the essay Empirical and Transcendental Modes of Givenness of the Real World. Our being in the world can be viewed as an apparatus of viewing. There she writes, every simple experience is always already exceeding, is always transcendental. End quote. We are immersed within and primarily constituted by the reality of the world, of which we are a real part. Seeing this, we might understand our eyes as having their own spiritual dimension, through which we can see the spiritual dimension of the spiritual cosmos. It is as if, she writes, we have spiritual stalked eyes, Stielaugen, that is, the antenna-like eyes of a snail. This is a beautiful metaphor for how we are in the world, in the spiritual attitude. We can shut down this spiritual attitude and strive to limit ourselves to the givenness of the senses in a merely empirical, natural attitude, and such striving characterizes ordinary natural science. But it might also be the case that we are naturally more open to the spiritual attitude than we might initially imagine. We are not limited to the sense-phenomenal dimension. Part 3, Conrad-Martius's Doctrine of Universal Ontology. So what does Conrad-Martius ultimately discover, or posit hypothetically, hypostatically, or hypokaimonally, after decades of ontic research? We now leap to the mature phase of the development of her philosophy. Eberhard Ave Lallemant was Conrad-Martius's student, friend, and disciple. In his 1971 dissertation, Phenomenologie und Realität, and again in a later essay with the same title, translated by Herbert Spiegelberg in his definitive book, The Phenomenological Movement, Ave Lallemant identifies the overall phenomenology of Conrad-Martius as ontological phenomenology. This is certainly accurate. In fact, Ave Lallemant explains that amongst her explicit reflections on phenomenology in relation to Husserl, Heidegger, and Nikolai Hartmann, she identifies her own position as ontological phenomenology. But Ave Lallemant also identifies in the same paragraph her mature project with the term universal ontology. The significance of this designation is reflected in the thematic organization of her Nachlass, assembled by Ave Lallemant, where it appears first among other thematic headings. And I'll share that when we're done as well. I'll show you the Conrad-Martiusiana, or the index of it at least. In Phenomenologie und Realität, Ave Lallemant devotes a chapter to this topic of universal ontology. There, he explains that Conrad-Martius set to work on the elaboration of the positive presentation of a universal ontology beginning in the 1930s. This project was subject to repeated interruptions due to numerous unfortunate external circumstances in the early 1930s, and continuing into the 40s, and so on. The story of these interruptions is the same story of interruptions to the project of the metaphysics of the earthly, told recently by Rodney Parker in the introduction to that work, and the appendix of Jim Hart's 2020 book, Hedwig Conrad-Martius's ontological phenomenology. Avi-Lallemant extends this story to include the other works on universal ontology, including the 1957 publication of her book on ontology, thus Sein, and the essays of the first part of her Schriften, Volume 1 of 1963. These essays include such important works as Transcendental and Ontological Phenomenology, and The Existential Depth and Profundity of Being and the I. English translations of these two by Kriniger-Schwantner is forthcoming in September of this year. In fact, as an appendix to the Metaphysical Conversations. There are altogether 20 pieces directly on universal ontology, Avi-Lallemant tells us. Many of them appear to be about the real material and psychical consequences of a doctrine of prime matter and other primordial categories neglected by the idealistic tendency of traditional metaphysics. But overall, Conrad-Martius's universal ontology offers a genetic method of hypostasizing reality and virtuality. Building upon the text of the Metaphysics of the Earthly, translated and edited by James Hart and Rodney Parker, and also a diagram in which Conrad-Martius drafts an ontological schema of her universal ontology, I will conclude this talk by describing the overall shape of Conrad-Martius's metaphysical architecture of universal ontology. The universal ontology and the Metaphysics of the Earthly were both unfinished, but we should look to them for a developing picture. There is a section of the Metaphysics of the Earthly called the Fourfold Root of Elementary Natural Reality, which is unfortunately unavailable, but together with this diagram and the first set of pages that we do have, we can begin to understand Conrad-Martius's universal ontology. An extended discussion of this diagram and this context exists in the December 17, 2021 meeting of the Reading Group webinar, webinar of the Society for the Phenomenology of Religious Experience, which is available on YouTube, which included detailed analysis by Rodney Parker and James Hart. To conclude today's discussion, I will describe the fundamental elements in terms of the four roots as four existential primal dynamisms, the primordial twofold from which they arise, and the ultimate primordial dynamic from which it all arises in Conrad-Martius's universal ontology. I will take some speculative license for the sake of a more intuitive summary. 1. The most primordial act in Conrad-Martius's universal ontology is the movement from nothingness into being, called the ontological dynamism. We might also think of this as the movement constitutive of finitude in the context of the absolute infinite. And we could also call it creation. In the wake or halo of this most primordial act, which transcends all sorts of space and time, of course, all things arise as actualizations and potencies of all sorts. This is the leap of being. 2. According to a retrospective glance, the primordial ontological dynamism can be seen to proceed in two different directions, infinitely in and infinitely out. She writes, "Nothing is more important than grasping this astounding structure of being, in which the two apparently contradictory moments come from the same ultimate root of being." Conrad-Martius calls these two basic polar constitution of real being, identified with an absolute above and an absolute below, heaven and earth, inner and outer, and infinite ecstasy, the infinite radiating out of itself, and infinite stasis or instasy, or infrastasy, she writes as well, the infinite inwards that is infinitely sunken into itself, forming a magic circle of spirit, she writes. These two are also called inner gravity, or metaphysical gravity, on the one hand, and metaphysical light, or ether, on the other hand. This last set of terms is particularly suggestive of the romantic philosophy of nature, from which the a priori analog of their universal ontological functioning takes root. 3. The further duplication of these two opens a fourfold framework. The fourfold is divided into two material roots of being and two formal or immaterial roots, respectively. The prime matter, das Urmateriale, the prime dynamic or etheric, das Urätherische, the prime psyche or soul, das Urpsychische, and the prime spirit or primordial mind of the soul, das Urgeistige. We find these categories in the table of contents to the metaphysics of the earthly, and they inhabit the four corners of the diagram. Were we to only view the diagram without the rich context of Conrad-Martius's philosophy, we might think that the overall unity lies in the central element, Mensch, the integral man. Perhaps that unity is more like Adam Kadmon or Prajapati Atman. But if we take into account Conrad-Martius's system of levels of being deriving from the movement into being from nothingness, or from the absolute infinite, we can read the diagram differently. What is especially beautiful about the ultimate systematic philosophy of Conrad-Martius is how self-consistent and intuitive it is, and how harmonious it is with the broader context of perennial philosophy and contemporary syncretic systems such as theosophy and anthroposophy, which she frequently compares her thinking to. As we enter upon the age of Conrad-Martius, with the increasing availability of her work in New English translations and with renewed interest, it is imperative to understand her expansive and all applicable insights in the context of her motivations and goals, which abide in a spiritual attitude. This all-encompassing metaphysical framework is uniquely evident in the context of her universal ontology, and hopefully with this summary and illustration, this context can be more easily seen. Thank you. And here's the diagram, and I'll share this again in our discussion, and I hope to discuss it a bit more. Thanks.